The storm had been 3 days building before it broke over Marchcliffe, and when it broke hard, stripping the last leaves from the avenue of elms and driving the sheep into the lee of the stone wall, where old Tam the shepherd found them shivering at dawn. It was not Tam who found the dead man. It was Susanna Ray, sent out at first light with a basket of bread for the gatehouse, who saw the shape half in the ditch where the drive met the turnpike road, one arm flung out across the mud, as though he had been reaching for something, even as he died. She did not scream. She had buried a mother and 2 brothers before she was 20, and screaming had never once brought any of them back. She set down her basket, knelt in the wet grass, and looked at his face long enough to know she had never seen it before. Then she looked at his hand. The ring caught the gray light before anything else did. Gold, heavy, the Marchcliffe falcon cut deep into a blood-red stone, worn on the 3rd finger, the way she had seen it worn 100 times across a breakfast table she was permitted to clear, but never to sit at. She had mended the glove that covered that hand only 4 months before, kneeling at his feet with a needle between her teeth while he read a letter and did not look at her. And she would have known that ring blind, by weight alone, by the particular chip at the falcon's wing that no jeweler in the county had ever been asked to repair because His Grace had refused to have it touched. His Grace was the Duke of Marchcliffe. His Grace had left the house 11 weeks ago on a journey he had explained to no one, and had not been seen or heard from since. And here, in a ditch at the edge of his own land, in a dead stranger's clothes, was his ring. By noon the house had stopped pretending it did not know what it meant. By evening the vicar had come and gone, and Mrs. Prynne the housekeeper had wept once, hard, into a dish-towel in the servants' hall, and then straightened her spine and told the maids there was work to be done, regardless of what heaven allowed. Susanna scrubbed the front steps that no one would climb that week, and said nothing to anyone about the small wrongness she had felt, kneeling in the mud, a wrongness she could not yet name, and carried it folded small against her chest, the way she carried everything she was not permitted to say aloud. She was 22, the daughter of a tenant farmer ruined by 2 bad harvests, and a landlord who was not the Duke, but might as well have been for all the difference it made to a girl left with nothing but her hands. She had come into service at 14. She had risen by patience and by a memory for detail that her betters found either useful or unsettling, depending on their mood. From scullery to under-housemaid to the temporary and much-envied post of assisting His Grace's own man before his valet had taken ill, and His Grace had, unexpectedly, not minded a maid's hands instead. It had lasted 6 weeks. It had ended when he left. She had gone back to blacking grates and had told herself, quite firmly, that this was correct and expected and no cause for any feeling whatsoever. It was during those 6 weeks that she had found, tucked at the back of a locked cabinet she had been asked to dust, a small porcelain shepherdess broken clean through at the crook of her staff, and had mended it herself with glue borrowed from the estate carpenter, rather than trouble anyone above her with so small a thing. His mother's, His Grace had said, when he found her at the task, and had said nothing further. Only looked at the mended crook a long moment before returning the figure to its cabinet. And Susanna had thought, at the time, that it was a strange thing for a duke to keep locked away rather than displayed, though she had not thought it her place to ask why. The dismissive verdict came before the ring had even gone cold in evidence. It came from Mr. Edmund Cross, second cousin to the Duke, and the nearest male heir the family could produce on short notice, who arrived from London within the week, wearing mourning he had clearly packed before he left, and who found Susanna in the corridor outside the study, where the ring now lay upon a velvet cloth, awaiting the magistrate. "You are the girl who found him," he said. Not quite a question. "She was, sir." "Then you have done your part," he said, and his eyes went past her to the door, as though she were a piece of furniture that had briefly moved. A servant's imagination is a fine thing for a servant. It has no business troubling men who must settle an estate. See that you remember the difference. She remembered it. She remembered it standing very straight in the cold corridor with her hands folded over her apron. And she remembered it that night lying awake in the attic room she shared with 2 other maids, turning the wrongness over and over until she understood, at last, what it was. The ring on the dead man's hand had been worn on the 3rd finger, correctly, the falcon facing outward as it always faced, though the chip at the falcon's wing, the one she had felt beneath her thumb 100 times while mending gloves that fit too tight across his Grace's knuckles, had not been there. The ring was whole. It was a small thing. It was, she told herself, turning onto her side in the dark. Likely nothing at all. A trick of grief and mud and a dead man's cooling hand. She did not sleep all the same. And in the morning she did not tell Mr. Cross, because Mr. Cross had already told her, quite clearly, what her word was worth. If you had asked her, in the weeks that followed, to say precisely why she began watching instead of simply working, she could not have told you. Perhaps it was only that a house in mourning has a great deal of watching in it regardless, and hers had always been sharper than most. Perhaps it was that grief, when you have carried enough of it, teaches you to distrust its symptoms in others, and something in the swiftness of Mr. Cross's arrival, the practiced sorrow of his black gloves, sat wrong against her the way the whole ring had sat wrong against a dead man's finger. The stranger came to Marchcliffe a fortnight later, on foot, in the rain, asking Mrs. Prynne at the kitchen door whether the estate had need of a man who could read a ledger and mend a fence with equal competence. He gave his name as Mr. Ashe. He was tall in the way that made low doorways a personal grievance, dark-haired, with a stillness to him that Susanna noticed before she noticed anything else. The stillness of a man standing at the edge of a room he did not want to be seen entering. Mrs. Prynne, short a groundsman since the old one's rheumatism had worsened, and shorter still on trust for anyone new since the events of the past month, looked him over for a long moment, and then said the estate could always use a man who did not ask too many questions about who was master of it just now. He did not ask any. He worked. He mended the fence along the lower pasture in a single wet afternoon, and when Susanna brought the outdoor men their bread and cheese at midday, she found him sitting apart from the others. Not from unfriendliness, she thought, but from the same instinct that kept a hurt animal at the edge of the herd. "You are new," she said, because it seemed unkind to say nothing at all. "I am," he said. "And you are the one who found him." He did not say it as Mr. Cross had said it. He said it the way a man says a fact he has been turning over and finds he cannot set down. "I am," she said, and waited for him to tell her what her imagination was worth. He did not. He only looked at her a moment longer than was quite proper, and then thanked her for the bread. And she went back to the house with the strange sensation of having been looked at rather than looked past, which she had not felt from any man since she had knelt at a breakfast table mending a glove. If Marchcliffe and everything true have taught this house anything, it is that the eye which finally sees a woman clearly is rarely the eye trained to look for rank. The weeks that followed the storm settled into an uneasy shape. Mr. Cross, though not yet confirmed in the succession, began to sign for coal and wages, as though the confirmation were a formality already accomplished. The Dowager Duchess, his Grace's aunt by his late uncle's marriage, who had raised Edmund at her own table since his father's ruin, and loved him with the fierce, incurious love of a woman who has decided a thing is settled and will not be troubled twice, moved through the house approving his decisions before he had finished making them. Susanna watched them both from the edges of rooms where she was meant to be invisible, and found herself, for the first time in 8 years of service, unwilling to be invisible in quite the way that was expected of her. She found Mr. Ashe again 3 days later in the walled garden at dusk, kneeling not at any task the estate had set him, but beside the old dovecote, coaxing a bird with a broken wing back onto its feet, with a patience she had rarely seen a man spend on anything that could not repay him. She stood in the gate a long moment, unseen, and watched him speak to the creature in a low voice she could not make out the words of. Watched his hands, large and careful, cup it without once tightening. "You are gentle with it," she said at last, and he startled, the way a man startles who has forgotten, briefly, that he is being observed by anyone at all. "It did nothing to deserve its hurt," he said. "That seems reason enough." She thought of Mr. Cross's face in the corridor, of the word imagination said like an accusation, and something in her chest, some small locked door, eased open a fraction. "Not many men think that reason enough," she said. "Then I have met the wrong men," he said, and for a moment something crossed his face that was almost a smile, quickly put away, like a coin returned to a pocket before anyone could see its worth. She did not know, that evening, watching him carry the bird to a box lined with straw in the tool shed, that she had just witnessed the first honest thing he had done since he had walked back onto his own land, wearing another man's name. It was 2 mornings later, behind the stable block where the household could not see, that Mr. Cross found Susanna scrubbing a milk pail and pressed 2 gold coins into her palm before she had understood what he meant by it. "There need be no more talk of chips and rings," he said, low and reasonable, the voice of a man who believed every problem could be settled the way he settled his tailor's bills. "Say only that the ring was whole and correct in every particular, as any sensible person can plainly see it was, and this trouble need never touch you again." He closed her fingers over the coins himself, as though the matter were already concluded. She looked at the gold in her palm for a long moment, more money than she had held at one time in her whole life, enough to see her through a hard winter or buy her mother's old debts clear at last, and she thought of the chip beneath her thumb that had not been there, and she thought of a duke who had once thanked her by name for a mended cuff when no one else remembered she had one. Then she opened her hand and let the coins fall into the mud at his boots. "I know what I felt, sir," she said. "I will not unknow it for gold." Mr. Cross's face did something complicated and unlovely, and he told her, as he turned away, that she would regret her stubbornness before the month was out, and she did not doubt that he believed it. What she did not know, standing alone afterward with mud on her apron and her heart beating hard and strange in her chest, was that Mr. Ashe had been mending a hinge on the stable door not 10 feet distant, and had heard the whole of it, and had stood very still behind the old timber, with his hands gone motionless on his work, watching a housemaid refuse more money than he paid her in a year, rather than sell a truth she could not even yet prove. He did not speak to her of it that day, or the next. Something in the way he looked at her afterward, all the same, across the yard or over the heads of the other men at their midday bread, had changed its weight entirely, the careful distance of a stranger giving way, quietly, to the particular attention of a man who has just watched someone prove exactly what they are made of. She did not yet know what she had seen. You may already suspect it. The days lengthened into a fragile ordinary. Susanna carried coal and turned linens, and twice more carried bread to the garden wall where Mr. Ashe worked with a steadiness that seemed less like labor than like penance. Though for what she could not have said. He asked her once about the Duke, in the careful voice of a man asking after a stranger, and she found herself telling him things she had told no one, not the way His Grace had once thanked her by name for a mended cuff when no one else in that house remembered a maid had a name at all, not the particular quiet of him at breakfast, reading letters that seemed to trouble him more than any ledger ought. Mr. Ashe listened with his whole body still, the way she had seen him listen to the broken bird, and when she finished, he said only that it sounded as though she had known him better than most. "I knew his gloves," she said. "That is not the same as knowing a man." "Is it not?" he said, and there was something in his voice, some old grief pulled taut, that made her look up at him properly for the first time since the gatehouse. "It is more than most men are known by, in a house like this." She thought about that for 3 days. On the 4th day, Mr. Cross called the household staff together in the great hall, ostensibly to reassure them of continuity, while the magistrate's inquiry ran its slow course, and used the occasion to observe, in front of 30 servants and the Dowager Duchess seated at his right hand, that certain persons in this house had lately taken to embellishing a tragedy with fancies unbecoming their station, and that he trusted such persons understood the difference between grief and invention. He did not look at Susanna when he said it. He did not need to. Every eye in the hall found her regardless, and she stood among the other maids with her chin level and her hands still, and said nothing, because there was nothing a housemaid could say in that hall that would not be called exactly what he had already named it. Mrs. Prynne found her afterward in the linen room, folding sheets with more force than the task required, and did not ask what was wrong because she had heard the whole of it standing at the back of the hall. She only took up a sheet herself and folded beside her in silence for a while, the way she had folded beside Susanna's mother once, years before, in a different house, before either of them had known how far a woman could fall, and still be expected to fold linen with steady hands. "He is a frightened man playing at a confident one," Mrs. Prynne said at last. "Frightened men are dangerous, child, because they cannot afford to be wrong, and a man who cannot afford to be wrong will call the truth a lie, before he will call himself mistaken." "I am not wrong," Susanna said, and was surprised to hear how certain she sounded, having said the words aloud for the first time. "Then you had best be careful who you say so to, Mrs. Prynne said, and pressed her hand once, hard, before returning to her sheets. It was Mr. Ashe, she told, in the end, 3 evenings later, in the tool shed, where the mended bird now perched on a low rafter, and watched them both with a bright, indifferent eye. She had not meant to. She had come to bring him a lantern against the early dark, and found herself instead telling him about the chip in the falcon's wing, about the ring that had been whole on a dead man's hand when it had never once been whole on the living one, about 11 weeks of silence from a duke who had, whatever else he was, always answered his own correspondence within the week. He was very quiet when she finished. He turned the lantern over once in his hands before he set it down, and when he spoke his voice had a roughness in it she had not heard before. "You have told no one else this." "I told Mr. Cross nothing," she said. "I have told you everything." "Why?" he asked, and it was not a challenge. It was closer to a plea. "Because you asked," she said, "and because you looked at that bird, as though its hurt mattered to you, more than whether it could ever be useful to you again. I have not met many men who look at anything that way. I thought perhaps you would look at the truth the same." He was silent long enough that she thought she had frightened him, or worse, bored him, and she had half turned to go when he caught her hand, lightly, at the wrist, the way a man catches something he is afraid will break if he holds it too hard. "Susanna," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his mouth went through her like heat through cold water. "There is a thing I have not told you, and I am no longer certain I can go on not telling it." "Then tell me," she said, and did not pull her hand away. His father, the old Duke, had died 4 years before, believing himself ruined by a steward the family had trusted for 2 decades, a man who had bled the tenant farms dry through false accounts while assuring his master, week after week, that all was well, until the truth arrived too late and all at once, and broke something in the old man that never mended. Julian, for that was the name he did not yet give her, had been abroad at the time, on his father's own insistence that he see something of the world before he inherited the burden of it, and he had come home to find his father 3 weeks dead, and the estate mortgaged to men who smiled at him in London clubs, while their agents circled Marchcliffe like gulls over a wreck. He had spent 4 years rebuilding what patience and silence could rebuild, and had trusted no steward, no agent, and very nearly no man since, because the last time he had trusted a man with his family's fortune, that trust had killed his father as surely as any blade could have done. "I did not leave 11 weeks ago to travel for pleasure," he said. "I left because I had begun to suspect the man managing my northern accounts of the same slow theft that ruined my father. And I could not prove it wearing my own name and my own coat, because every man who owed his post to my family would tell me only what he thought a duke wished to hear. I became no one, so that I might finally be told the truth. And the ring," she said, though she already knew, though her whole body had gone very still, "was taken from my traveling case 3 weeks into the journey, in an inn outside Feversham, by a hand I did not see and have not yet proven. I did not report it. A duke who has quietly become no one cannot easily explain the loss of his own signet without becoming somebody again, and I was not yet finished being no one. The man in the ditch," she said, "was not me," he said very quietly, and something in his face, some 4 years of held breath, seemed to loosen for the first time since she had known him. "I believe he was paid to wear it. I believe he was paid by a man who needed the world to think me dead before I could return, and prove what I had gone to prove." She did not ask him why he had not simply walked into the house and said so. She thought she understood it already, standing in a tool shed with a bird watching from the rafters, and a man's hand still light around her wrist. A duke returning too soon, with no proof but suspicion, against a cousin already halfway confirmed in the succession, and an aunt who loved that cousin without question, might find himself dismissed exactly as easily as a housemaid had been dismissed in a crowded hall. He needed more than his own word. He needed, she realized with a small, private wonder, precisely the sort of quiet, unregarded watching that a duke could never do, and a maid did every day of her life without anyone troubling to notice. "Then let us find your proof together," she said, and if he looked at her, in the lantern light, as though she had just handed him something he had not known how badly he needed, she did not let herself examine that look too closely. Not yet. Not with so much still unproven and so much still to lose. He had not released her wrist. She noticed it only then, the warmth of his hand where it rested, the particular stillness of a man holding himself in check, and she found she did not wish him to let go. He leaned toward her, slowly, the lantern light catching the gray of his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them moved at all. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, his own coming rough and careful as though he were counting each one. "I want you," he said, low, the words costing him something visible to say plainly, rather than dress in a duke's careful phrases. "Not as a duke wants a convenient wife, and not as a man wants comfort in a hard season. I want you, Susanna, in whatever shape you would have me, groundsman or duke, and I have wanted it since a woman with mud on her apron looked at a dead man's ring and would not be told what she had seen. She felt the want in her own chest, sudden and startling, a warmth that ran from her wrist where his hand still rested up through her whole body, and she leaned toward him in turn, close enough now to feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that a single inch more would have ended the matter entirely. Then she stopped, and so did he, both of them very still in the candlelight, because a kiss taken now, with his name still unproven and her position already lost the moment his cousin learned of this hour, could not be unmade by morning. And neither of them was willing to let it be born of half a truth. "Not yet," she said, and it cost her as much to say as his own confession had cost him. "Not yet," he agreed, and pressed his mouth instead to the inside of her wrist, once, softly, a promise held in reserve rather than spent, before he made himself let her hand go. "You should know," he said, "before you decide to help me, that I cannot promise you safety in this, and I cannot yet promise you anything else either. Not while my own name is in question. I have never once in my life been promised anything," she said. "I find I do not much miss it. If you are still uncertain what this house owes her by its end, remember only this. She was never once asked what she wanted for herself, until a man with no name of his own thought to ask. The proof, when they began to hunt it, proved slower to find than either of them liked. Susanna could not leave the house without occasioning comment, and Julian, still wearing the name Ash and the rough coat of a groundsman, could not ride to Faversham and question innkeepers without risking recognition by some steward or magistrate's clerk who had once dined at his own table. It was Mrs. Prynne, told at last the whole of it in the linen room, with the door bolted and her hand pressed to her mouth for a full minute before she trusted herself to speak, who solved the difficulty by remembering that her own nephew kept the posting inn at Faversham, and that a housekeeper's letter asking after a stolen ring and a hired traveler would raise a great deal less suspicion than a duke's. The answer came back within the week, in her nephew's careful, unschooled hand. A gentleman answering to the name of Mr. Cross had indeed stopped 3 nights at the inn some weeks past, and had been seen in close conversation, twice, with a thin, fever-eyed traveler called Tobias Kemp, a man known about the yard for taking any coin offered for any errand, however strange. Kemp had left the inn wearing a ring he had not arrived with, boasting to the stable boys that he was bound for a fine estate on a fine errand, and would want for nothing again. He had been seen once more, a fortnight later, on the turnpike road in weather no sensible man would travel in, 3 miles from the gates of Marchcliffe. He caught a fever on the road, and no one thought to help him, Julian said. When Susanna read the letter aloud to him in the tool shed by candlelight, and his voice had gone very flat, the flatness of a man holding something enormous very still, so that it would not break loose and do damage. He did not die because anyone struck him down. He died because a man who wanted my death convenient sent a sick man out into a storm wearing my ring, and did not trouble to ask whether he would live to deliver it as planned. That is not murder, in the way the law would name it. It is something colder. She thought of Edmund's careful mourning clothes, packed before he left London, and found she agreed. They had a name, a witness, and a letter, but no proof that would stand before a magistrate against a man already half-seated in a dead duke's chair. And so the days that followed were spent in the particular misery of knowing a thing utterly and being able to prove almost nothing of it. It was in this stretch, with the proof still thin, and the household's grief hardening slowly into acceptance of Edmund as its master, that Susanna heard the dismissive verdict a third time, and this time it did not come to her face. She heard it from Hetty, the youngest of the maids, who came to her white-faced in the scullery one evening, and said the Dowager Duchess had been overheard telling Mr. Fenwick the solicitor in the drawing-room not an hour before that the girl who found the body had lately taken to gossiping with the new groundsman about fancies best left to the magistrate, and that if the talk did not cease, she would see the girl turned off without a character, imagination, or no imagination. Fenwick, Hetty said, had looked uneasy at the words, but had said nothing to gainsay them. Susanna stood very still at the scullery table, with a knife halfway through an onion, and did not weep, because weeping had never once, in her whole life, made anything easier to bear. And because she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, exactly what she was worth to the people who currently ruled her world. Nothing. A pair of useful hands and a mouth that had better stay shut, she told Julian that night, in the tool shed. With the bird long since flown, and only the two of them and a guttering candle left in it. And he was quieter than she had ever seen him. Quiet in the particular way of a man doing violence to his own restraint simply by remaining still. "She will have you turned off," he said. "She has said as much." "Then I have waited too long," he said, and rose, and for a moment she thought he meant to go that very hour, coatless, to the great house and end it with nothing but his own furious certainty, and she caught his sleeve the way he had once caught her wrist. "You have no proof that will hold against him yet," she said. "Only anger. Anger will lose you, Marchcliffe, as surely as silence nearly has." He stopped. He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face was almost wonder, that a woman with nothing left to lose but a place at a scullery table should be the one counseling patience to a duke. "You are right," he said. "I dislike very much that you are right." "You will grow accustomed to it," she said. And for the first time in 3 weeks, something like a smile passed between them, brief and grave, before the weight of the hour settled back over both of them, like a coat too heavy for the season. The eviction, when it came swiftly and without warning 3 days later, in the form of Mrs. Prynne's own trembling apology at the kitchen door, and a folded note in Mr. Cross's hand, instructing that the housemaid Ray was to be gone from Marchcliffe by nightfall, her wages paid to the day, and no character given, for conduct unbecoming her station and injurious to the peace of a grieving house. Susanna packed the whole of her life into a single canvas bag in less than 20 minutes, because a life built on 8 years of service leaves in the end remarkably little to carry, and stood at the servants' entrance in the last gray light with nowhere in the county that would take her in without a character and no way now to reach the man in the tool shed to tell him she was going. It was Mrs. Prynne who found Julian instead, breathless, her cap askew, and it was Julian who reached the gates at a dead run in time to see Susanna already halfway down the turnpike road with her bag over one shoulder and her spine as straight as it had been the morning she found a dead man in a ditch and did not scream. "Susanna," he called, and she stopped, because that voice, saying her name, had become in 3 short weeks a sound she would have known blind, by weight alone, the way she had once known a ring. "I have proof enough now to be a fool with," he said, catching up to her, out of breath in a way no groundsman's labor had ever left him. "I have waited for certainty because I was taught that a man who trusts too soon loses everything, and I very nearly let that lesson cost me the one thing my father's ruin never touched. I am done waiting for certainty, Susanna. I would rather be wrong beside you than safe without you." She looked at him, mud spattered and hatless in the last of the light, and did not, for once, ask herself what a maid was permitted to want. "Then let us go back and be wrong together," she said. And they turned, side by side, toward a house that did not yet know its master had come home. The great hall of Marchcliffe had been readied for a memorial service the household could delay no longer, a formal acknowledgment before the county of the master presumed lost, and it was into that hall, candle-lit and hung with black crape, crowded with tenants and neighbors and a magistrate come to make the loss official at last, that Julian Hale walked 3 minutes before the service was to begin, still in a groundsman's rough coat, with Susanna Ray a half-step behind him, and Mrs. Prynne's nephew's letter folded inside his coat. The room did not gasp all at once. It gasped in a slow, spreading wave, beginning with the footman nearest the door, and rolling backward through 30 years of neighbors and tenants, until it reached the Dowager Duchess in her black silk, and Edmund beside her in his mourning clothes. And it was Edmund's face, Susanna thought afterward, that told the whole of the story before a single word of proof was spoken. The particular gray stillness of a man watching a lie. He has built his life upon collapse in real time, before witnesses he cannot silence. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, into a silence so complete the candles seemed loud, "is this indeed His Grace the Duke of Marchcliffe?" "It is," said Mr. Fenwick the solicitor, stepping forward with a steadiness Susanna had not expected of him, having compared, at Julian's whispered instruction not 10 minutes before, the mark beneath the collar that only a father's physician and a family solicitor had ever been shown. A small old scar from a childhood fever that no forger could think to counterfeit. "It is His Grace. Beyond any doubt, I am able to raise." Edmund did not speak. It was the Dowager Duchess who spoke, her voice cracking across the hushed room like a dropped glass, demanding to know then who lay buried beneath the family stone not a fortnight past. And it was Julian who answered her, quietly, in the voice of a man who has decided that mercy, here, will do more work than fury. "A man called Tobias Kemp, aunt, hired and sent out into a storm wearing my stolen ring by a person who required the world to believe me dead before I returned to prove what I had gone abroad to prove, that Marchcliffe's northern accounts have been bled for 4 years. By theft your own household steward committed at another man's direction. A man who stood to inherit everything, the moment I was declared lost." The room turned, as one body, to Edmund Cross, whose careful mourning had been ready before grief had any right to be, and found in that turning exactly the reckoning that a hall full of witnesses is built to deliver, and no magistrate needed to pronounce. He did not shout. He did not deny it with any conviction left in him. He only stood very still, the color gone entirely from his face, while 30 people who had bowed to him for a fortnight remembered, all at once, precisely how little they had ever trusted him. It was the Dowager Duchess who broke first, not in fury, but in something smaller and sadder, a hand pressed to her mouth, the word Edmund escaping her twice, brokenly, before she sank into the nearest chair and said nothing further at all. An old woman discovering in a single candle-lit minute that the nephew she had loved without question had been unworthy of the question she had never troubled to ask. Julian let the silence hold a moment longer than comfort would have allowed, because some verdicts require their full weight to land before mercy can follow them. And then he turned, deliberately, from the ruin of his cousin to the woman standing a half-step behind him in a groundsman's borrowed coat, mud still drying at the hem of her one good dress, and he took her hand in front of the whole assembled county exactly as he had taken it in a tool shed 3 weeks before, lightly, at the wrist, as though he were afraid still that she might break. "This is the woman who found the truth when every voice in this house told her to be silent," he said, and his own voice did not shake. She saved Marchcliffe. She will be its Duchess. No one in that hall gasped a second time. They had used their gasping already on the discovery that their Duke was alive. What passed through the room instead, Susanna would think later, was something quieter, and in its way, larger. 30 faces that had looked past her for 8 years, turning to look at her properly for the first time, and finding, in that look, something that felt almost like an apology none of them would ever think to speak aloud. The winter that followed was the gentlest Marchcliffe had known in 4 years. Edmund was gone from the county by the new year, his fortune reduced by restitution, and his name reduced further by a story that traveled the length of England's drawing rooms faster than any letter could have carried it. And the Dowager Duchess, humbled rather than ruined, remained at Marchcliffe still, quieter now, kinder in the small, unshowy ways of a woman who has learned late what her certainty had cost. Mrs. Prynne kept the household as she always had, though she wept again. Once, happily this time, the morning Julian asked her to stand as witness at a wedding, rather than merely to arrange the flowers for one. On the evening before that wedding, Susanna sat by the fire in the small parlor that had once been the old Duchess's own, mending, out of long habit rather than necessity now, a tear in a glove that did not strictly need her hands at all, and on the mantel above her, where it had stood since the week Julian brought it down from a locked cabinet and asked her, quietly, to keep it somewhere she could see it, sat the small porcelain shepherdess that had been his mother's, its crook mended long ago along a hairline crack by a housemaid's careful hand, before either of them had known what that mending would come to mean. Julian came and stood behind her chair and rested his hand at her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because there was, at last, nothing left that needed saying aloud. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall on the turnpike road where a dead man's ring had once told the whole county a lie, and inside, by a fire that had finally stopped being cold, a woman who had once believed herself worth nothing more than a pair of useful hands sat mending a glove for no reason but that she loved the man who wore it, and was, for the first time in all her 22 years, entirely and unmistakably seen.